All right. Welcome to the Rise Up Podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Mitchell. And on this show, I do my best to help you rise up to your potential, get out of your own way, and live a happy and healthy life that's on your own terms. And thank you so much for spending time with me today. If you're a first-time listener, so happy to have you here. Hope you find something valuable. If you're a long-time listener, thank you so much for stopping by and listening to me rant and rave about the stuff that I love. I love helping people understand because ultimately, if we don't understand these things, if we don't learn to understand ourselves, it's very, very difficult to make the change that we want to see for the long run. So let's jump right into it and talk about the biggest reasons why it's difficult to break bad habits and how you can start, becoming aware of yours and doing what it takes to change the bad habits for the better. Because ultimately, habits are formed for a reason. And if you listen to my show, I love giving people why and then the how. So let's first start by understanding why we even form habits to begin with. I love helping people understand like your brain makes millions of decisions every single second, all the time, without you being fully aware of them. And it's great. It's glorious because if you don't have to think about heart pumping, if you don't have to think about digesting your food, you don't have to think about your lungs, you don't have to think about your liver, you have to think about any of the core functions that your body goes through on a regular basis. That just happens for you, but that's still your brain functioning, and it does a great job at nullifying those operations enough for you to live your life. Um, it puts those things on autopilot, right? Your brain has to function for those things to work. Those signals have to be sent. If you had to be aware of those decisions, of all those mechanisms all the time, well, we all have busy, chaotic lives. Just think how even worse things would be if you always had to think about it. So our brain is really, 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 really good at taking things that aren't that are taking things and putting them in a functional way that doesn't always have to take up brain space, or it doesn't have to take, yeah, it's brain space. It doesn't have to take extra bandwidth. It puts it on autopilot so it can operate on other things that that it enjoys, whatever those things may be. Now, those mechanisms, right? Those are all inherent, right? A lot of us don't have to live our lives thinking about our organs functioning. Now, our brain has that same mechanism for how we live our day-to-day life. And it's important because if we didn't have this, it would be very difficult because we would be thinking about every single tiny decision on a regular basis. Um, so take like driving, for example. When we first learn how to drive, there's a lot of stuff going on all at once. There's a lot understanding how the car works, all the mechanisms, and then we have to then factor in how that mechanism works. Then we have to factor in operating that mechanism while we're driving in traffic. And there's a lot to learn in the very beginning, but eventually we get to a point where we get in our car, we don't have a second thought about driving. Like a lot of us can forget the entire drive over there. It's like we get in the car and the next thing we realize we're where we're supposed to be, because driving becomes so automatic, right? That is a habit formed. That is how our habits are formed. They become an unconscious thing that we don't have to that we don't think about. And it's awesome in a lot of ways because ultimately it gives us more room for other things that we enjoy or we're interested in. So things that are automatic, like driving, become something that doesn't isn't as a big of an impact in a lot of what we do in our day to day, right? This is a very powerful and a very effective thing that we need to have to function in our normal lives, right? But this is how our mind works because we have a lot of things going on all at once. We learn a lot. We learn a lot all the time. It takes the information that is important and puts it in on autopilot, just as it makes the information that it's important for us to function as a normal human being and puts it on autopilot. So now, when we're forming habits in our day-to-day life, this mechanism is still operating and saying, how can I make this an unconscious thing that I don't have to think about so that it happens for a specific reason, right? What reason did I practice this behavior or this habit so much? What did I get from it so much? And apparently, if I practice it enough, it's important enough for to be an automatic mechanism that our brain doesn't want to think about anymore. So, bad habits. What? Biting your nails, turning to food when we're emotional, drinking in excess, spending too much money, whatever the habit is that may be holding you back from feeling the way that you want to feel, that thing was practiced enough for enough reasons that your brain said, "Great, this is going to be this is going to be a important thing to you. we're going to just make it a pattern that happens without you needing to think about it. We're going to save you the time. Just let it be. Just let it happen over and over and over again. And then it gets to a point where then that's those habits, usually habits that um, affect the way that we want to feel or affect the goals that we have with our health. They go unchecked for a long period of time until we get so uncomfortable that we want to change. And then when we try to change and that habit just happens all the time, even though we know better or we want to see something different, we start to get in our heads. We start to feel very miserable. And we start to the cycle is very the cycle is a very vicious one. So I want you to understand, like, hey, it's normal. It's okay. It's a challenge. It's a challenge to break, but it's not just because you don't want it bad enough. It's because your biology, your brain chemistry does this on purpose, and you lacked awareness when it was happening. You didn't think of the long term quote unquote damage or struggles that you would face when you were practicing a certain bad habit that you're dealing with today. You're only aware of it after the point where you're tired, you're fed up, and you want to see change. Or you've done it multiple times and you know yourself and you know your usual hiccups and your usual setbacks. So now the why is it's normal. There's nothing wrong with you. This is how our brain chemistry works, right? I don't want you to sit here and think, okay, well then I'm stuck. Like, no, like change is possible. Trust me, change is definitely possible. It is oftentimes a lot harder than most people are willing to accept. Because just because you want it doesn't mean it's going to happen. And and especially doesn't mean it's going to happen as fast as you want it to. So now, how do we take these bad habits, quote unquote bad habits, and check them at the door and don't let them happen as often in a way that ultimately gets in the way of us showing up for ourselves. This is what I make sure I cover all my bases on when I'm working with people in the very beginning. I can give anyone macros, I give anyone a certain workout, but if I don't help them address the bad habits that are ultimately going to happen, whether they like them to or not, and give them the tools and the mechanisms to catch those patterns and then decide to do something different, no matter the macros, no matter what they're doing, they will eventually fall into those old patterns that got them to the place where they're uncomfortable. So this is important. This is a very important step that everyone needs to learn. I've probably talked about this in multiple different ways, but this is why the bad habits are formed, and this is how we get rid of them. The first one, the most important step. Most important step, I've already mentioned it a couple times, but the first thing you have to do if you're trying to break your bad habits is create awareness around the habit, right? It's one thing to know that you have the habit. It's another thing to know why you have the habit and how often you're having that habit, right? Because it happens unconsciously. We don't think about it until it's either we're actively doing it or it's already done. So we need to be able to see it and identify the situations, the circumstances, whatever it is, and catch those patterns and say, hey, I see you. I see it. I know that this leads me down the path that usually leads me to feel frustrated or whatever. Okay, that's fine. Right? We just need to first see it, because without awareness, without being able to catch that pattern, without being able to catch that behavior and just see why it's popping up, right? Or what triggers it to happen, you will not be able to really from the root remove it from the root and replace it with something more ideal for your goals, be it weight loss, be it mental spirituality, whatever. Most people is something with weight loss, right? But just need to get good the very beginning at catching it, right? If we get good at catching it first, one, we're going to decrease the amount of pressure on us to immediately change it off the bat, right? Because most people want it to happen quicker than it really will, and they want to just, when they know it, when they feel like they know better, they think they should just get rid of it. But that's not the case a lot of the time, right? It's not like that. It takes time to change a pattern that our brain puts on autopilot. We have to consciously deal with the subconscious, and that's not easy. Our subconscious is designed to make it difficult, or to make our lives quote unquote easier, to make us make less decisions on a regular basis. It wants to try and help, but there's a pattern or a behavior or a habit that it's ultimately getting in the way of our success, there's multiple levels to it. So the first thing you have to do is just be aware of it and see it and catch it, right? I like to have people take like a note, a sticky note, or just on their phone and just say, "Oh, I see it. I see it. I did the thing." Right? I was emotional, I turned to food or whatever, right? Just catch it and see how often it happens on a regular basis, right? And quantify it. If we can start quantifying it, then we can start measuring, hey, this happens like 14 times a day. All right, if I can get better at bringing that down to 9, 10 times a day, that's progress. And that ultimately gives you the ability to work your way to creating realistic goals. But that's another rabbit hole that I will probably talk way too long about. So the first step, catch it, be aware of it, quantify it. This happens this many times a day, or this habit. I think about this habit when I do this habit when this thing happens. As much awareness that you can create so that you can see it in any situation or scenario that is in your life. Because ultimately, when we find it one way, that's great. But usually there's multiple ways that it happens. And I want you to be able I want the person in front of me to be able to see all those possible behaviors and patterns because it will ultimately make it a lot easier for the next steps, right? So moving on to number 2. All right. The second thing that you have to do after you've created the awareness, right? Because most people struggle with bad habits because they lack the awareness around it, or yeah, the awareness around it, like like the circumstances, the situations, emotional state, and the quantities. How often does it happen, right? Then we move on to the understanding or grace period. All right. So this is where now I need people to understand, like, if you know better and you're still doing it, you're not a bad person. It's not that you don't want your goals bad enough. Give yourself a break. All right. If you're truly trying to change this for the better and for the long term, give yourself some grace and say, hey, I have not yet found success at limiting this behavior or getting rid of this behavior that's holding me back from accomplishing my goal. That's fine. All right. Give yourself a break, because you would give your children, you'd give your best friend a break if they were doing something that they knew wasn't ideal for them. Right. Treat yourself like your best friend or your kids or your spouse or whoever you care about. Give yourself the break too. All right. Just remove the pressure, because you can't self-hate yourself to change. Right. You can create change. Don't get me wrong. You can do things to change your body because of self-hatred or whatever, or beating yourself up or whatever it is. But ultimately, you're not creating an environment within yourself to want to sustain those things, because ultimately we're inherently stubborn. And when we force ourselves to do something, it's like when our parents force ourselves to do something, or a boss forces you to do something you don't want to do. You don't do it with excitement. You do it with resentment, or you do it with frustration. And we only have a certain amount of bandwidth to deal with frustrating things. If our life has a lot of frustrating things going on, we will tend to cut the thing that's easiest to cut to give us more bandwidth. So ultimately, giving yourself a break. And this is not like a lot of people can say, well, then I'm just giving my excuses to be lazy or not do it fast enough. Let's say, again, there's a fine line with this. You're trying to, if you treat it in absolutes, like everything has to change all at once, or there is no allowance for grace period, you should just always do better. Like, again, like, absolutes are very difficult patterns to break. So we don't want to create other patterns. We don't want to create a short-term solution that leads to long-term problems. Yes, you can do a lot in a short amount of time, but if you're doing it in ways that aren't ideal for you, there's not much grace. It's just built with animosity, frustration, resentment. There's going to be other developing patterns that you're going to create that you don't want to that are going to make this a lot harder to deal with. All right. So ultimately, learning to say, all right, I give myself a break, and then we understand, hey, why was I doing this pattern? I'm aware of the pattern. All right, I give myself a break that I do it and I don't like that I do it. But now I need to understand why. Why do I do this? What do I gain? What am I getting out of this pattern? Right. And I love talking about this because this is so important for people to understand. There's three parts to any behavior. All right, three parts to it. There's a trigger. All right, there's a trigger or a stimulus that our brain receives, and that trigger or that stimulus sends the pattern to our brain to perform an action, bad habit, right? To get a reward, right? Those are the three parts: trigger, action, reward. And usually, a lot of times, the reward is to feel better in some way or shape or form, to relieve stress, to blow off steam at the end of the day, whatever it is, right? And so, understanding your behavior. Now that you see the behavior, you're aware of the behavior, you're giving yourself a break, and now you're learning to understand the behavior, right? Why do I do it? What's the trigger? Oh, I see the trigger now. I see when I'm emotional. I see when I'm stressed. I see when I get annoyed. I see when someone yells at me. I see when I'm overwhelmed. There's so many things. That's when the pattern happens. That's when I start to ultimately I start to behave on that action, right? So I guess understanding and awareness where we're starting to see how often it happens, like that's you creating the key steps to understanding so that you'll understand the reward, because we can't change the stressors in our life. We can't control the triggers or stimulus in our lives all the time. And we can't control the reward either. It's not a bad thing to want to blow off steam or to feel better or to reduce stress or any of those things. None of those are bad. But the behavior is where we actually find control, the action. You have an unconscious action that leads to a reward that may not actually give you as much of the reward as you hoped. If you do something, do the bad habit that gives you temporary relief but leads you to feeling guilty, ashamed, or whatever, then that behavior that you're doing isn't actually solving the problem, isn't actually giving you the reward. It's a temporary relief that leads to longer term issues, longer term problems. So our goal, once we are aware of the triggers and the stimulus and the patterns, or we're aware of what causes the stimulus or the triggers, we give ourselves a break. Like, okay, I've been doing this pattern for a long period of time. I need to, I need to, I need to be, I need to be okay. I need to give myself a break. I need to be okay with it. And then we start to understand, okay, this is why I am doing this behavior because I want to get this reward. I'm getting this reward from it. The action that we're taking is no longer in alignment with how we want to feel. So now we need to find a new behavior, a new action. And now this leads to number three. Number three is taking action, deciding to take a different action consistently. Enough times to rewire the mechanisms that your mind has created based off the triggers that you have dealt with. Our brain is capable of learning anything, and when it learns things, it takes our neurons and it binds them together. So when one neuron fires, a whole group of them fire. That's why uh we have patterns and behaviors in general. Because one neuron is triggered, and then a whole pattern follows in the actions. So when we're trying to rewire and prune those old behaviors, we need to one, see, okay, well, the first neuron that gets triggered is us being aware and seeing the triggers, right? And then if we let that loop, that string of neurons complete, well, then we're just practicing the old behaviors. We're just perpetuating the old behavior. So if we let that happen, it's very difficult for us to really break those habits. But if we decide, okay, I see the pattern, I see and I understand the reward that I want to get, and we decide to do something different, even in the smallest way, even in the smallest way, something is better than nothing. You will start breaking one, you'll stop the pattern in your mind. You'll stop that trigger from fully completing. You'll stop that loop from fully completing. And now your brain has to think in a different way. Your brain has to find a different conclusion, a different result that it's not aware of, that it's not prepared for. It's very scary. Now this is us relearning something. And when we stop firing the same neurons, our brain starts reaching out to different neurons and saying, okay, that old pattern wasn't completed. What are we supposed to do now? And then that's where that action taking in the middle, finding something that's a little bit more ideal for how you want to feel, right? Going for a walk, you know, going for a walk, spending 5 minutes with yourself, drawing, doodling, reading, whatever, something that's just a little bit more ideal with how you want to feel, right? To start replacing the old pattern that has held you back. For example, if you eat when you're stressed or emotional, right? I'm emotional, so I eat to feel better. But then after you're done eating, you feel guilty and you see the scale keep going up and you have a weight loss goal, right? That pattern, ultimately, we need to stop that pattern from happening. So now we see if I'm emotional, that's when the trigger hits. So I'm emotional. I need to decide. I'm aware. I see how often I can get emotional in my day to day. Now, in those moments when we're in step three and we're trying to take action, you see the pattern, you feel yourself getting emotional, you know that you're going to turn to the pantry, right? This is hypothetical. This doesn't have to be everyone, but I want to give you an example. You know, you turn to the pantry, you grab the candy, you grab the easy to overcome some food, right? So now in that moment when you find yourself in the pantry and you're about to grab the thing, all you have to do is say, you know what? I'm going to close the door and I'm going to go stand outside for 5 minutes. Cool. Great. Well done. You stopped the pattern before it was completed. And now your brain, even though it doesn't feel like a lot, right? It's not earth shattering, it's not groundbreaking, but this is how we rewire our mind. Now your brain is like, oh crap. Wait a second. You didn't do the thing? You didn't do the pattern like we're used like we practiced thousands of times? Okay, that's weird. I'm gonna keep prodding you to go and fulfill this pattern, but I'm gonna try and goad you back into this pantry because I want you to fulfill it. This is what we're used to. This is what we usually do. Come on, let's get back to it. And you consciously you're fighting against that subconscious when you don't let it happen, even in the smallest way, and you give yourself time to really just get away from that situation or decide something different. Now that action that you took, even though it's small and it may not lead to immediate change on the scale or may not get rid of the habit altogether, you are now training your brain to fire in a different way. And this right here, this is where you're going to spend a lot of your time, is making those smaller, those decisions that ultimately rewire your brain chemistry. You're going to do that as often as you can. And even if you decide to do something different and you still find yourself back in the pantry and you still eat, you still interrupted that pattern and you still made progress. Now, this is the hard part. This is the hard part because every time we feel like we go off the rails, we fulfill a bad habit and we tear ourselves down, we feel guilty, we feel emotional, we feel frustrated, we feel like we should have done better. Ultimately, this process is pretty painful. It is because you're going to let yourself down a lot. Because if you've practiced a behavior, a bad habit for years, decades, the majority of your life, that is not going to go away after 1 week, not 2 weeks, probably not even a month. It's probably going to take months until you can finally say that that habit no longer is the predominant decision you make based off the trigger that you have. And I'm not telling you that to scare you. I'm telling you that because I'm trying to be honest. I want you to change for the better. And this may take longer than you want it to. You need to learn how to be okay with that. Because when you become okay with how long it'll take for you, or it may take a little bit longer, again, it just takes a little bit of the pressure away. And it's not supposed to get rid of the disappointment, it's not supposed to get rid of the pain. Because this is supposed to be painful. This is like you're actively taking something your mind has gotten comfortable with, even though you may not be comfortable with it, your mind is. And it's going to take enough pain, enough reminders over and over and over again for it to really stick and to solidify that the new pattern that you want to create is far more ideal for the long run. And if you give yourself the time and if you give yourself the time, if you give yourself the appropriate amount of time, the appropriate amount of consistency, and you accept that, hey, this is going to suck. It's not going to be ideal. And every time you do find yourself slipping, but you still learned to make some sort of consistent effort over and over and over again, eventually you get to the point where you don't think about it as often, where you don't have those slip ups as often, where you don't feel like you're quote unquote messing up as often. You ultimately create a lifestyle, that new pattern, and you get to practice it, and then you get to ingrain to the point where it starts to replace that old way of thinking because you accepted, hey, this is going to suck from time to time. It's not always sunshine and rainbows, but learning something new, getting something we want, nothing worth having comes easy. A lot of this stuff, but that's why I'm talking about this, because I want you to know it's okay. I want to be realistic with you. I want to tell you the truth. I don't like it may take longer than you want. It may be more painful than you want, but compare that to the pain that you're currently in, the discomfort that you're currently in. Which one is more bearable? I've said it a few times on the show recently. Change doesn't happen until the change of uh until the pain of change outweighs the pain of staying the same. And when you realize, okay, this is painful, like either way, it's painful. Which hurt, which hard are you going to choose? And if you choose the one that's hard, but will ultimately lead you to a much more ideal scenario where you'll have the improved habits and you'll have the results that you want, it makes it more manageable. Doesn't take away all the struggle and the pain, but it makes it a little bit more manageable. All right, so let's move on to number four. Um, Oh, actually, I've been, it's so funny. If you're watching this on YouTube or on the video, I had a list of what I was going to talk about. And it's so funny. Every time I give a presentation or I have a list, I end up talking about the things that I want to talk about without realizing, and I'll end up going over. So essentially, I just combined three and four, which is consistent action and then pairing it with consistent time, right? Just give yourself more time than you think you should, right? It may like there's certain people out there that can get to where they want to be within 6 months. That's great. That's awesome. There's a lot more people out there that it may take longer than that, and that's okay. That's not a bad thing. If you think if you think of future you when you're close to your deathbed, it's not fun to think about, but if you think like you're on your deathbed and you had accomplished the health goal that you had and you had been able to live comfortably for, an extended period of time, right? Do you think older you cares how long it took to get there? If you got there? Probably not a lot of time. Most people, you know, I'm not talking to people on a deathbed on a regular basis, but from what I've read, what I've heard, what I listen to on a regular basis, most people on their deathbed, the biggest regret are the things that they didn't accomplish, or the things that they didn't try, or the things that they didn't stick with. It's easy to put it off till tomorrow. It's easy to put it off now because we feel like we have a long life to live, but our life can go by quicker than we realize. And unfortunately, yeah, we have a lot of uncomfortable situations in our lives, a lot of painful situations in our lives, and we inherently want to avoid pain and discomfort. But no matter what we want to accomplish, there's going to be some challenges along the way. If you learn that, hey, sometimes it's not going to be pretty, it's not going to be perfect, but I'm still going to try, I'm still going to make the effort, I'm going to I'm going to allow myself the time that as long as it needs to takes. As long as I get there, that's all that matters. Because once you're there, like how you get there is how you're going to keep the results. And this is the framework that ultimately will help you identify your patterns and rewire them for the better. Because I want people to create the results that they want, that will last, that they feel confident in themselves to keep and stick with without fear of losing it all. So yeah, I hope that made sense. I hope you found it helpful. Just in summary, when you have a bad habit, when you're struggling with, first thing to do, be aware of it, catch it, see how often it happens, right? What's the trigger? What's the stimulus that sends you down those patterns of using those bad habits? Number two, give yourself a break and learn to understand, like, hey, this is why I do it. This is why I see the pattern. This is why those patterns are happening. Or this is why I do this. This is the reward that I'm creating. Number three is then that's where you take consistent action, no matter how small, no matter how much it feels like you're not doing much. As long as you're doing something different and going in the right direction, that's amazing. That will get better. And number four, give yourself or allow yourself more time. Right? It may not happen in a few months, especially if you've been practicing something for years, the majority of your life. That's okay. Keep trying. Keep doing something. Something small is better than nothing at all. As long as you keep doing that, I promise. I promise. Just as someone who's actively trying to work on himself on a regular basis and grow and change, it's not easy. It's a lot of time not pretty. And some things are really, really painful. But that pain is necessary because ultimately we inherently hate change. We hate pain. When we experience enough pain in one way, the way that has kept us the same for a long time, we learn to adapt and find more ideal ways to avoid that pain. And eventually that pain happens less and less. And you get to create the experience, the results that you want with a lot less of the pain involved. So, like I said, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this, even in a small way, or found it helpful, I'd greatly appreciate it if you share with one person. My entire goal is to help you in even a small way. And even if I never speak to you directly, I hope to make even a small impact on your journey. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.